Okay, for this lesson, we'll be looking at fortifying solids and semisolids. Fortifying of solids and semisolids simply means adding an active component or an active ingredient to produce a more concentrated preparation. So it's like you adding sugar to already sweetened drink, but because the drink might not be to your liking, you add a little bit more sugar to make it a little bit more sweet. That's the concept of it. You're adding excess active ingredient to make the existing formulation more concentrated. The concept here is not reducing the volume or weight, but adding to it. So if we add a diluent, we expect that the concentration of the drug in that formulation would decrease. However, if we add more active ingredient to an existing formulation, we expect that the concentration will increase. In this case, we are adding more of the active substance. So although we are effectively increasing the weight of the existing formulation, the change in the concentration is now going to be dependent on what is being added. So if you're adding diluent, expect the concentration to be reduced. If you're adding active ingredient, you are going to expect that the concentration is going to increase. So let's look how this concept can be used. It's very, very useful, and I want for us to know how it is that we can apply it in our day-to-day pharmaceutical practice. Let's say we have an ointment, a zinc oxide ointment, 5%, 3,200 grams of it, and we want to increase this concentration to say 20%. So we're moving from 5% to 20%. The only logical thing to do is to add more zinc oxide powder to fortify the existing ointment. So what is it that we need to know? One, we need to know the proportion of active ingredient and base in the existing ointment. That's the 5% ointment. And we also need to know the proportion of active and base in the ointment that is to be prepared. That's the 20% ointment. So the first step is to determine what information was given. We know that we have a 5% ointment, and we know we have a quantity of 3,200 grams of it. And we know that we want to make or turn that existing ointment to a 20% ointment. The quantity we don't know. But what we do know is that we're going to add zinc oxide, additional zinc oxide powder to the existing ointment to make this 20%. So we're expecting that 3,200 grams of ointment will now increase. By how much? That's what we're going to try to find. So this here diagram is just showing us what's really happening. So this is the zinc oxide powder. We don't know how much we're going to add. We want to add it to the existing cream, 5%. 3,200, and we're going to get a cream that has a concentration of 20% and is going to contain 3,200 grams of the existing 5% cream plus a certain amount of zinc oxide. That's what is going to happen. So let's look at step 2. We need to determine the amount of active ingredient and base in the existing ointment. That's the 5% ointment. Now, if you know an ointment, normally you find them in tubes. It's going to contain base, and it's going to contain the active pharmaceutical ingredient. In this case, 5% is going to be the API, and 95% is going to be the base. Now, of course, the ointment is not going to look like this in the tube. It's going to be homogeneously mixed. That powder, the zinc oxide powder, which is white, is going to be homogeneously mixed throughout the entire formulation. So you won't see demarcations as how I'm illustrating it here. It's just for us to understand what's happening. So if we know that the existing cream or ointment that we have is 3,200 grams, and we know that 5% of that 3,200 grams is zinc oxide, then we can determine the amount of zinc oxide powder that would have been in that ointment. Similarly, we know that 95% of the ointment is the base. And that means that the total amount of base in the 3,200 gram ointment would be 3,040 grams. Now we're throwing around the words base. What does base mean? The base in an ointment is really the vehicle or the diluent, but they're all meaning the same thing. It has no therapeutic value. Sorry, it has no therapeutic value, meaning it's not going to confer any therapeutic response. All it is there to do is really to carry the active ingredient. So that is our base. Now, step 3 says we are to identify the proportion of the base and the active ingredient in the 20% ointment that is to be prepared. Now, if it's a 20% ointment, right off the bat, we know 20% is going to be zinc oxide, and we know 80% is going to be base. So if we should do a diagram to represent this information, we know that this is going to be 80%, which is the base, and this is going to be 20%, which is the zinc oxide. Recall that the base of the previous ointment will now be the base for the existing ointment. Now, how did we arrive at that conclusion? Let's go back here. If it is that we are going to fortify this cream, we need to add excess zinc oxide powder or additional zinc oxide powder to the existing ointment in order to produce a 20% ointment. So what is changing? All that is changing is we're adding zinc oxide powder to it. We're not adding any base. We're not subtracting any base. We're not taking anything outside of the existing ointment. We're adding to it. So the base is not gone anywhere. It's still there. So it simply means then that the base is not changing. All that is changing is the zinc oxide that's already there, because we're adding zinc oxide powder to the existing ointment. But what is not changing is the base. So it means then that the base that we started off with is the same base we're going to end up with, because we're not removing it from the existing ointment. So since the base of the existing ointment, which is the 5% ointment, is 3040 grams, 3040 grams, and the base in this 20% zinc oxide ointment will also be 3040 grams. So this means that the same base in the existing ointment will now become the base in the new ointment. That is, 80% of the ointment to be prepared will now be 3040 grams, which represents the base. That means the 20% ointment will be zinc oxide, which we are now trying to determine. So the step 4 is determine the total amount of zinc oxide that will be contained in the 20% ointment that is to be prepared. So we know it's a 20% ointment, and we know that 20% is going to be zinc oxide and 80% is going to be the base. Since the amount of base contained in the existing ointment will be the same in the ointment that we need to prepare, we already know the total amount of base. And based on that, we can use ratio and proportion to determine the total amount of the 20% zinc oxide ointment. Right? So, since 80% of the ointment is base and is represented by 3040 grams, then 20% of the same ointment is going to be zinc oxide and is represented by X. We do a little cross multiply and we find that X is going to be 760 grams. But what does this mean? This means that 760 grams of zinc oxide represents 20% of the ointment. So if we should do things graphically or using a diagram to represent, this is 80%, and this represents the base, which is 3040 grams. And this is 20%, which represents the zinc oxide, and this is now going to be 760 grams. But if we recall what we had at the beginning, was 160 grams of zinc oxide and 30-40 grams of base. And essentially, we're adding zinc oxide powder to the existing ointment, because this would have been 5% and this would have been 95%. We're adding to this such that we will have a total now of 760. So you're adding something to this 160 grams of zinc oxide to get 760 grams. So in order to determine now what then is what you add, what is it that you added to this existing 160 grams of zinc oxide to end up with 760, the most logical thing to do is to subtract 160 from the 760 and you get 600. All right. So basically what you have for your new formula for this would be zinc oxide ointment 5%, 3,600. Is it 3,600 that we had at the beginning? Let me just double check here. 3,200, my apologies. So it would be 3,200. Okay, so it's 3,200 and let me make this a little bit thicker. And zinc oxide powder is going to be 600 grams. So you mix these two together on an ointment tile and you're going to end up with 20% zinc oxide ointment. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how you will be able to fortify an existing ointment. I hope that you would have learned something and applied well. Thank you for listening and all the best.